They thought he was wasting time, layering logs 3 deep, while others rushed to beat the first snow. But by midwinter, when their fires barely kept frost off their blankets, his cabin stayed warm enough to grow seedlings on the windowsill. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from. And if frontier survival stories like this fire you up, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. The frost had come early in the autumn of 1839. It arrived with a stillness so quiet, it made the trees seem like they were holding their breath. By the first week of October, the pond near the Clark brothers' cabin had already iced over, and the wind coming off the Bitterroot Range cut like a blade. Nathaniel Clark, the elder of the two, had grown used to cold nights in the Montana Territory. But that year, something was different. The cold didn't just visit, it settled, burrowed in, and stayed. Their cabin sat low in the draw, built the year before with rough logs and hurried hands. It had kept them dry through rain and snow, but it never held heat. The cracks between the logs breathed with the wind. Nights were spent huddled under every blanket they had, the fire down to embers by morning. Nathaniel could live with discomfort. He'd done so his entire life. But his brother Eli was only 16, with lungs still healing from last winter's sickness. On the night of October 18th, the cold turned deadly. A storm rolled down from the mountains without warning. Temperatures dropped below zero, and the wind howled through every seam in the cabin walls. Nathaniel did what he could, stoked the fire high, blocked the door with blankets, wrapped Eli in his own coat. But by dawn the firewood was gone, the air inside was like glass, and Eli's lips were blue. Nathaniel sat beside him for hours, refusing to accept what had already happened. He held his brother's hand until it no longer held back. Outside the snow kept falling. Inside, something inside Nathaniel hardened. They buried Eli in the frozen ground 2 days later, after the sky cleared. Nathaniel used a mattock to chip through the earth, cursing the cold with every blow. He marked the grave with stones, then sat beside it for most of a day, silent, unmoving. That winter dragged on. Nathaniel survived, barely, burning everything he had, crates, tools, even part of the cabin wall. When spring came, he didn't rebuild, not right away. He tore the cabin down to the last log, then walked the land in silence, studying the wind, the sun, the slope of the valley. He wasn't going to build another shelter. He was going to build a solution. Because now he understood something with a clarity no book or sermon could teach. Cold didn't just kill. It seeped in through every mistake a man made when he thought good enough would do. It punished shortcuts. It didn't forgive guesswork. Eli hadn't died from bad luck. He'd died because their walls had gaps. And Nathaniel Clark was never going to let cold through a wall again. Nathaniel spent that summer cutting wood, not for fire, but for thought. He wasn't building yet, not physically. But inside his head, he was laying out every beam and corner of a structure that didn't yet exist. He carved small models from scrap pine, testing angles, measuring joints, sketching on bark when paper ran out. He started keeping a journal, something Eli had once teased him for. Every entry began with the same words. Keep the warmth in, keep the cold out. He'd write that line before every new diagram, like a prayer. Then he'd try to answer it. How do you keep the warmth in? The first answer was obvious, thicker walls. But he'd seen cabins with thick logs still turned to iceboxes by midnight. It wasn't just about size, it was about separation. How cold leapt from outside wood to inside skin like lightning down a rod. That's when he thought of the fox. Years ago, he'd skinned a silver fox and noticed the animal's coat had 2 layers, a dense underfur beneath a longer, looser outer layer. The air caught between them, warmed by the animal's body, protected it from the cold. What if a cabin could do the same? Not a single wall, but 2 or 3 layers, gaps. Air itself, trapped and still, became insulation. It was a strange idea, air as warmth. But the more he thought, the more it made sense. Heat didn't just leave through walls, it escaped through contact. A single cold log touching a warm hand stole its warmth instantly. But if there was no direct path, if heat had to jump through still air, it slowed down. That was the fox's trick. That was nature's trick. He tested it in miniature. Built a wooden box with an inner lining separated by an inch-wide air gap. Set a candle inside, measured the wax melt against a box with no lining. The difference was small, but real. In winter, a small difference meant life. By September, he had the plan in his mind: an outer wall, a hollow space, then a second wall built inside, staggered joints, overlapping seams, nothing in line. No wind could blow straight through. The heat inside would stay trapped like breath under a wool blanket. People laughed when he explained it. One trapper called it a double coffin. Another asked if he planned to live with the squirrels. Nathaniel didn't argue. He just went back to sharpening his axe, because he didn't want a cabin anymore. He wanted a shield. By the time the leaves began to turn in early October, Nathaniel Clark had already felled more trees than most men used in 2 seasons. Not just any trees. He chose them like a craftsman choosing his words. He walked miles to find straight trunks with minimal taper, thick enough to hold heat, light enough to lift without killing himself. He passed on dozens that others would have taken without question. He wasn't looking for fast. He was looking for right. Each tree took a full day. Drop it, limit it, cut it to length, drag it out with his mule carefully, like hauling a child. He stacked the logs in rows, 3 separate piles, outer wall, inner wall, and what he called the thermal break frame. Most cabins used 40 to 50 logs. Nathaniel was cutting close to 150. The trappers who passed by stared at the stacks like they were a funeral pyre. "You building a church?" one asked, half laughing. "More like a vault," Nathaniel answered, not smiling. They shook their heads and moved on. Even the axe became part of the process. He resharpened the bit every evening, sometimes 2 or 3 times a day. A dull blade bruised the wood, and bruised wood meant warping. Warped logs meant gaps, and gaps were how the cold got in. He built a jig to test log diameter, a wooden circle carved to his exact minimum, 10 inches. Any log that didn't fit snug was tossed aside or trimmed down for internal use. The cabin walls wouldn't just look straight. They had to be straight. When warmth was your enemy's prize, precision was your only defense. Then came the hardest decision: location. He left the old cabin site behind despite the emotional weight of Eli's grave nearby. That valley floor was a cold trap. Shadows lingered there long after sunrise. So he moved uphill, a short rise that caught morning light, and shed wind better than the lowland. It meant harder hauling, longer walks to water. But every choice had to serve one goal: keep the cold out. By mid-October, the site was clear, level, and dry. He dug his trench for the foundation, deeper than most, then filled it with layered rock and packed earth. The stones absorbed heat from the sun, even on cold days. Not much, but enough to make a difference underfoot. Then he laid his sills, the first logs that would anchor the whole structure. He worked from dawn till dark, ate cold beans straight from the can, slept in a lean-to he'd built just far enough away to keep from damaging the build site. At night, he'd wake shivering and use that discomfort as motivation. If he felt warmth slipping from his bones, he imagined it slipping from a future cabin wall, and rose with renewed urgency. He wasn't building a home anymore. He was building revenge against the cold. It started to look like a cabin in early November, but only from a distance. Up close, it was something else entirely. Nathaniel wasn't stacking logs like others did. He was weaving them, interlocking 3 frames: the outer shell, the inner structure, and the thermal skeleton in between. Every layer had its logic. The outer wall was his armor. Thick, bark-stripped pine logs, fitted flush, corners overlapped and pinned. He drilled deep and pegged them with wooden dowels soaked in linseed oil to prevent shrinkage. These logs took the brunt of the wind, the snow, the frostbite that rode in on January nights. But behind those came the heart of his idea. A third frame built not directly inside, but offset, standing independently with a small air gap. Just enough space to trap still air. It wasn't wasted space, it was working space. A buffer, like the fat on a bear's back or the down beneath a goose's feathers. Between those two layers, Nathaniel built his secret, the hollow core frame. Instead of joining the outer and inner walls directly, he floated a third skeleton structure using staggered uprights and cross ties, forming a labyrinth of sealed pockets where air could rest without moving. Air didn't need to be hot to help, it just needed to stay put. Movement killed warmth, stillness held it. Each log of this core frame was shaved to uniform size, planed smooth to minimize splintering, and set in offset rotation. No seams aligned, no joints shared. Where the outer log had a knot or curve, the inner log curved the opposite way. The idea was simple. No straight shot for wind to pass through. Heat had to fight its way out, and cold had to get lost in the maze before reaching inside. It looked strange. 3 walls, one inside another, with strange spacing and unfamiliar geometry. But when he stood in the gap and blocked the sun with his hand, the light barely made it through. That was proof enough. He sealed the internal frame just as carefully. He used a homemade chinking compound of clay, moss, deer hair, and a dash of wood ash, a mix he had perfected after dozens of cold night failures. It stuck, flexed, and cured with no cracks. When dried, it rang when tapped, like fired pottery. At night he tested it, set a candle on the floor and ran his hand near the seams. No flicker, no draft. He hadn't just stopped the wind, he'd confused it. Nathaniel kept sketching everything, measurements, mixtures, timber choices, but not for publication. He wrote it down because he knew no one would believe it just by seeing it. Some men hunted bear, he hunted entropy. And so far, he was winning. By late November, the walls stood tall and layered like the hide of some great beast. But the gaps, small as they were, still whispered with cold when the wind blew just right. Nathaniel had solved the structure. Now he had to solve the seal. And in the mountains, there was no Home Depot, just mud, moss, ash, and memory. He started with what every trapper knew, moss and mud packed into seams. It worked well enough until it dried, cracked, and fell out in handfuls by February. That was how last winter had begun to kill Eli. Nathaniel remembered it too clearly, the wind cutting in through a chink they'd patched with haste and hope. It had howled all night like some predator tasting the weakness in the wall. So he changed the recipe. He mixed the clay not just with water, but with fine wood ash, sifted from his own stove, to make it lighter and more adhesive. He added shredded moss he had dried in the sun to avoid rot. Then came the most unusual ingredient, deer hair, fine, fibrous, and durable. He plucked it from hides and leftover trimmings, grinding it between his palms until it resembled straw. The first batch was a failure, too wet. It sagged in the seams. The second batch dried too quickly and crumbled like biscuit dough. The third, mixed with a little beeswax melted in a pan, cured slowly but flexed when pressed. He tested it at night by running his fingers along the inside wall. No crumbling, no flaking. When the temperature dropped to 10 degrees, the interior stayed warm enough for water in his basin not to freeze. He called it breathable armor. It wasn't romantic. It was earned. As he packed the seams with his mixture, he spoke aloud not to himself, but to Eli. "You remember how we tried using pine tar that one time?" he muttered, pressing the clay deep into a knothole. "Smelled like death and leaked anyway. You'd be laughing if you saw this mess." But the truth was, he didn't hear laughter anymore, just wind, and his own breath, steady and stubborn. When the chinking was complete, he smeared a thin seal coat of ash and beeswax over the exterior, rubbing it in with the side of his fist until the walls glistened faintly in the late sun. It made the logs feel like cured leather. He stood back and looked at the whole thing. Walls like armor, seams like stitched hide, the work of weeks poured into every joint. It didn't look like a trapper's cabin. It looked like something ancient, something meant to endure. He lit a candle and held it near the corner seams. No flicker, no pull, just stillness. It was the closest he'd come to silence since the day Eli died. The first snow fell while Nathaniel was fitting the window shutter. Fat flakes, slow and silent, dusting the logs like powdered sugar. He stood in the doorway, looking out over the rise where smoke from other cabins curled thin against the sky. A few of those men had passed by in recent weeks, curiosity gnawing through their mockery. "What are you building there, Clark? A cabin or a root cellar for God himself?" Another had walked a slow circle around the site and grinned. "Looks like a man trying to hide from winter inside a log sandwich." Nathaniel didn't answer, not because he didn't have words, but because he didn't need them. Every laugh, every sideways glance was insulation in its own way. It hardened him, packed him tighter into purpose. The ridicule rolled off his back like snow from his overbuilt roof. Still, he listened. Their reactions were clues. They told him what the average man thought was enough. And that's what got most of them killed, thinking survival was about enough. One man, older, less cocky, had stood by the doorway for a long minute, not speaking. He ran a hand across the clay-packed chinking and nodded once. "You're sealing in warmth like a beehive," he had said, almost to himself. Then he walked off without another word. Nathaniel remembered that. It stuck. A beehive. Nature didn't waste heat, and it didn't apologize for overbuilding. He finished the shutter that evening, thick pine planks braced with iron and sealed with his own concoction. It didn't swing open on squeaky hinges. It locked. And behind it he stretched a square of treated canvas painted over with a thin coat of resin and ash, just like he'd tested on deerhide weeks before. It was translucent enough to let in light, thick enough to resist a bear's claw. The first window he'd ever trusted. Inside he laid the floor, tongue and groove boards, tight fit, mounted over runners to keep them dry and off the ground. Most cabins had dirt floors that turned to cold soup by February, not this one. The interior filled with a strange calm as the build neared completion. There were no gaps now, no echoes. Just the muffled thud of boots on treated wood and the crackle of a fire waiting to be lit. But the scoff still echoed from outside. Men who hadn't seen a bear rip through a cabin wall. Men who hadn't buried a brother in frozen ground. Men who'd call it overkill until the first real storm came. Nathaniel sat by his new door that night, sharpening his draw knife under lamplight. The wind had picked up again, howling down from the pass. He couldn't feel it. He was inside. And for the first time since last winter, he couldn't feel the cold. By early December, the valley was locked in snow, not the flurry-dusted kind that melts by morning, but snow that settled in and stayed. Nathaniel's build site, once a muddy mess of logs and tools, had been transformed. Now it stood proud and still, the finished cabin rising out of the white like a fortress built to outlast winter itself. He had finished the final chinking seam that morning, sealed the last window shutter, hinged the door with iron pins through mortised logs so deep you'd need dynamite to rip them free. Then he lit the first fire in the stone hearth. The flames caught slow and lazy, curling upward into the narrow chimney he'd built from scavenged river rock, each one placed by hand, dry fit and tested for draw. For the first time in 9 months, Nathaniel Clark stepped fully inside. He shut the door behind him. No creak, no rattle. He stood still in the center of the room. The logs glowed faintly with the light of the fire, their seams dark lines of clay and wax. Above, the roof beams pressed together in precise alignment, not a flicker of daylight showing between them. The air was still, heavy, not dead, but settled. Outside it was 8 degrees below zero. Inside he removed his gloves. He sat by the hearth and placed a tin cup of water on the stone ledge. 10 minutes passed. 20. The surface didn't ice over. It just shimmered, catching light, like glass. Then came the real test. He rose and walked the perimeter slowly, candle in hand, holding it close to the seams. No flicker. Near the window slot, still. Along the baseboard near the floor where most cabins leaked first. Nothing. Just heat. Heavy, dry. Heat that held its ground like a beast with its hackles up. He slept that night with only one blanket. It felt strange, dangerous even, like tempting fate. For months he'd wrapped himself in layers, curled like a hibernating bear, his breath fogging the inside of his own coat. But now he lay flat on a raised sleeping platform he'd built into the corner, the flicker of firelight washing over him. And he dreamed. Not of Eli, not of the grave, but of warmth, steady, quiet warmth, like sunlight through old glass. It was the first time in nearly a year he hadn't woken from the memory of frozen fingers and a body that wouldn't warm. When morning came, the fire had died to coals. The inside of the cabin held its warmth. The thermometer he'd hung on a nail read 42 degrees. Outside, the wind screamed and rattled the trees. Nathaniel stood up slowly, rubbed warmth into his beard, and cracked the shutter to watch the storm. He said nothing, but for the first time since his brother died, he smiled. 3 days later, a knock came at the door, sharp and sudden, like a branch breaking under snow. Nathaniel nearly didn't hear it at first. The storm outside had been howling since dawn, and the wind covered most sounds. But there it was again. 3 sharp raps, the kind made with urgency. He opened the door slowly, keeping his rifle out of sight but ready. On the other side stood a man, soaked to the bone, beard rimmed with frost, eyes wide with fear. Behind him, a woman and a young boy, maybe 7 or 8, wrapped in blankets that were more wet than warm. "We were headed east," the man stammered, shivering. "Snow hit fast. We lost the trail." Nathaniel stepped aside without a word. Inside, the change was immediate. The boy's eyes blinked rapidly at the warmth. The woman's face flushed as blood returned to her cheeks. The man just stood in place, his breath coming in hard, shocked by how warm the place was despite the storm. Nathaniel knelt by the fire, throwing on a few splits of dry pine. "You'll dry out quick," he said, his voice low but calm. "Storm's got another 12 hours in it, at least." He handed the boy a mug of warm water. The child gripped it like a lifeline. As the hours passed, the family's fear melted away. The boy curled near the hearth with his blanket and fell asleep. The woman, whose name was Clara, helped dry their gear and hung socks near the fire. Her husband, Thomas, studied the cabin in silence, noticed the layers, the angled joints, the heavy door. "You build this yourself?" he asked at last. Nathaniel nodded. Thomas rubbed his jaw. "It's warm as any parlor I've been in." Nathaniel didn't boast, just stirred the fire. Layered walls, sealed seams, air's got nowhere to go, so it stays. Thomas leaned back against the thick interior frame, shook his head in disbelief. "I've stayed in a dozen cabins this season. None of them feel like this. You could grow potatoes in here." They shared a quiet laugh, not loud, just enough to break the tension. As night fell, Nathaniel laid out extra furs for them. The family slept soundly through the storm. Their bodies relaxed for the first time in days. Snow piled high on the roof. Wind clawed at the shutters, but nothing got through. The next morning, Thomas pulled Nathaniel aside. "I'd be a fool not to ask. How'd you learn to build this?" Nathaniel looked out the frosted window. "By learning what not to build with," he said, "and surviving it." The man said nothing, but nodded with the weight of someone who understood. When they left that afternoon, the boy turned at the door and waved. "Thank you, mister," Nathaniel waved back. And for a long time after the door closed, he stood alone in the warm silence, watching their tracks vanish into the snow. The storm that brought the travelers lasted another 2 days after they'd left. Nathaniel used the time the same way he used every moment since Eli died: to learn, to record, to refine. Survival had taught him one truth: if something worked, you wrote it down. Because memory fades, but measurements don't lie. Pinned to the wall above his work table was a worn, leather-bound notebook, the kind traders used for fur tallies and debt records. But Nathaniel used it for something else, a different kind of currency: heat. At the top of the page, he had drawn 3 simple columns: outside temp, inside temp, time elapsed. Beneath that, day after day, he recorded numbers with almost religious devotion. He had salvaged a small thermometer from a trapper who froze out of his own cabin the previous winter, traded for it with salt pork and a promise to share the results. On December 14th, the outside temp dipped to 22 degrees at midnight. Nathaniel banked the fire at 10 p.m. and let it die down without adding fuel. By dawn, the fire was nothing but ash and a single glowing ember. Inside temp, 38 degrees Celsius. He scratched the number in with quiet satisfaction. 38 after 8 hours, with no fire. He moved to the seam along the east wall, ran his fingers along the clay mixture, still dry, no frost, no draft. He bent to the window, a small square cut 6 feet high in the wall, and opened the shutter just a crack. The wind burst in like a scream, but it hit the interior glass and stopped dead. The layered resin and canvas still held. Not a crack, not a bow, just dull, smoky light filtering through. He had found something, a pattern, a method, a proof. The cabin wasn't just warm, it was passively warm, holding heat not by fire alone, but by the structure itself, like a thermos, like a cocoon. That day he took it further. He made a duplicate sketch of the cabin on fresh paper and labeled each section in ink. He mapped airflow, noted thermal breaks, measured rafter span, and calculated roof load, drawing from observations he'd made, stacking sod atop the bark-lined beams. He added a new section, failure points. He marked none. But more than just numbers, Nathaniel began to feel something else. A sense that he wasn't just surviving anymore, he was inventing. The next week, 2 trappers arrived on the snowshoes, asking to see the warm cabin. They'd heard about it from Thomas. Word had spread downriver like a campfire story. They inspected the walls, knocked on the doors, felt the seams. Nathaniel didn't hide anything. He explained the air gap trick, showed them the resin mixture, even passed around his notebook. "If it saves you from frostbite," he said, "then it's worth the sharing." One of the men, a French-Canadian trapper named Jules, stood quiet for a long while, then offered a pouch of tobacco in exchange for permission to copy the drawings. Nathaniel refused the trade. "Take what you need," he said, "but remember where it came from." Jules looked him in the eye. "From someone who paid for it." Nathaniel nodded. By New Year's, 3 more men had come through, all with stories of cabins that smoked them out or froze them stiff. One had lost 2 toes. Another had nearly burned his lodge down, trying to dry wet gear too close to a fire that smoked through bad chinking. They stood inside Nathaniel's cabin, stunned. No smoke in the rafters, no frost in the corners. You could raise a family in here. Nathaniel didn't answer, because maybe, just maybe, that's what it was for now. By the time spring edged over the mountains, Nathaniel's cabin wasn't just a shelter, it was a statement. And others had begun to copy it, in parts or whole. One man built his own triple wall, using green timber, ignored Nathaniel's advice to strip the bark, and found himself chipping mold out of the air gap by February. Another tried to seal his window with stretched rawhide instead of resin canvas. It froze solid, cracked in a storm, and let in 3 days' worth of snow. But most who followed Nathaniel's method listened. They stripped the logs, staggered the joints, sealed every seam like it was a promise to their future selves, and they stayed warm. By the summer thaw of 1840, 5 more cabins in the valley were built, using what the others had started calling Clark Walls. It wasn't a title Nathaniel had asked for, but it stuck. Traders from Fort Owen heard about it. A scout from the Army outpost came to inspect it. He took notes, asked questions about defensibility. If this was a frontier post, the man said, it'd take dynamite to breach the corners. Nathaniel just shrugged. Or a bear with patience. He spent the warmer months refining smaller details, a sloped drain under the stone hearth to direct runoff, a food cache dug into the shaded side of the hill, insulated with bark and lined in stone. He built a bench under the window with hidden compartments, dry storage that stayed a consistent 45-degree year-round. Visitors still came, now bringing notebooks of their own. Some sketched, some copied by hand, others just sat in silence, eyes closed, feeling the warmth. A few offered to pay. Nathaniel refused money. "I didn't build this to sell it," he said once. "I built it because I buried someone who didn't get the chance." One day in late July, he walked up to the ridge above the creek where Eli's grave still rested. The marker stone had shifted slightly in the spring melt, so he straightened it, cleared the moss, laid a fresh pine branch across it. Then he sat. "I built something, Eli," he said quietly, "and it works." The breeze rolled softly over the hill. The sound of distant water carried from the creek. Somewhere in the trees, a woodpecker hammered at dead bark. The land felt different now, not safer, but not hostile either, like it had recognized what he'd built and nodded in approval. He didn't know if he'd stay in that cabin forever. But he knew this. It had changed the way people thought about shelter, about survival, about what a man could do with just trees, mud, and stubbornness, and, long after Nathaniel Clark was gone, cabins would still rise across the frontier using the bones of his idea, triple-walled, sealed tight, layered like the coat of a mountain fox, not out of luxury, but out of love, out of memory, out of knowing what cold can take and what warmth can save.